The reflection staring back seems familiar yet somehow distant. The eyes are the same but a little more tired than before. The skin carries traces of time, fine lines, shadows of sleepless nights, the quiet marks of years lived. You remember when those eyes sparkled with youthful fire, when the face carried no wrinkles, no weight of the past. And for a moment a quiet whisper arises. Where did it all go? We grow up believing this body belongs to us. We say, my hands, my face, my life. We decorate it, nourish it, polish it, and protect it. But deep down, if we pause for just a little longer, we begin to notice a truth that is often too uncomfortable to face. This body is not ours. It never was. It is borrowed, and one day it will be returned. The Buddha compared the body to a clay pot. From the moment it is shaped, it is destined to crack. No matter how much care we give it, no matter how beautifully it is painted, time, weather, and nature will take their course. Yet we cling to this pot as if it were indestructible, as if it would last forever. Think about how we live. We spend countless hours in front of the mirror trying to resist aging. We chase diets, products, surgeries, trying to hold on to something that was never meant to be permanent. The fashion industry thrives on this illusion. The wellness industry thrives on it. Even our fears thrive on it. And all the while, the truth waits quietly. This body is changing every single moment, and one day it will no longer respond to us. But if the body is borrowed, who did we borrow it from? Buddhism teaches that this body is composed of 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and wind. The firmness of our bones comes from earth. The blood flowing through our veins comes from water. The warmth in our skin comes from fire. The breath that keeps us alive comes from wind. None of these elements truly belong to us. We did not create them. We cannot control them. We merely hold them together for a brief time, like a guest in a house that does not belong to us. And when the time comes, the house will be taken back. The earth will return to earth. The water will return to water. The fire will flicker out. The wind will dissolve into the vast sky. What we called my body was only ever a temporary arrangement. This is not a thought meant to sadden us. It is not meant to make us hopeless. In fact, it is the opposite. Realizing that the body is borrowed frees us from the illusion of ownership. It invites us to see more clearly, to live more wisely, to hold life gently instead of clutching it with fear. Consider this. How differently would you live if you knew you were only renting this body for a short while? Would you still waste hours comparing yourself to others? Would you still fear every wrinkle, every gray hair? Or would you perhaps start to appreciate the fleeting beauty of each breath, each heartbeat, each sunrise seen through borrowed eyes? The great irony is that by trying so hard to own this body, we forget to truly live within it. We live as if tomorrow is guaranteed, as if youth is everlasting, as if death is far away. But death is not far away. It is closer than we imagine. And when we meet it, the body will not come with us. The body will stay behind, returning to the elements, just as it always has. The Buddha once asked his disciples to meditate on corpses, to observe the stages of decay, not to horrify them, but to awaken them, to help them see that what we cling to as self is just flesh, bones, and fluids, impermanent, fragile, passing. If we can see this truth clearly, then the fear of loss begins to dissolve, and in its place, a quiet wisdom arises. If this body is borrowed, let me use it well, while I still can. Perhaps the real tragedy is not that the body will end, but that so many of us spend our whole lives pretending it won't. We rush through our days, blind to impermanence, clinging to youth, resenting old age, fearing illness. And in that clinging, we miss the gift that impermanence is offering us: urgency, presence, gratitude. When you borrow something precious, you treat it with care, don't you? You don't waste it. You don't abuse it. You honor the time you are allowed to have it. What if we treated our body the same way? Not as a possession to flaunt or a prison to resent, but as a sacred loan. A fragile vessel carrying us across the river of life, just for a little while. This reflection is not meant to push us into despair. It is meant to open our eyes, to soften our grip, and to remind us of the freedom that comes when we let go of false ownership. Because when we stop clinging so tightly to the body, we begin to notice something else, something deeper, something that might just outlast the body itself. And it is here, in this realization, that the journey truly begins. Take a moment to feel your body right now. The weight pressing against the chair, the breath moving softly through your lungs, the warmth radiating from your skin. We call this my body, but what is it truly made of? The Buddha taught that this body is not a single solid thing. It is a temporary harmony of four great elements: earth, water, fire, and wind. They come together for a while, and then when the time is right, they scatter back into nature. The earth element gives us solidity. It is the hardness of bones, the strength of muscles, the texture of skin. Without earth, we would have no structure at all, nothing to hold us upright. But think carefully, was this earth element ever really ours? The food we eat, the rice, the bread, the fruits, all come from the soil. We consume them, and the earth of the world becomes the earth of our body. One day, this body will dissolve back into the same soil. We never owned it, we only borrowed it. Then there is the water element. Flowing through every vein, every cell, it nourishes and sustains life. Our blood, our tears, even the moisture on our tongue, all are forms of water. Without it, the body would dry, shrivel, and collapse. But this water is not ours. It came from the rain, the rivers, the oceans. It passes through us like a traveler passing through an inn, never staying for long. The fire element is warmth, the vital heat that allows us to move, to digest, to live. A body without fire grows cold, lifeless. Yet where does this fire come from? From the sun, from the energy of the food we eat, from the invisible currents of life itself. We cannot keep this flame forever. It flickers, it dims, and one day it will go out. And finally, the wind element. The gentle rise and fall of the chest, the breath moving in and out, the subtle circulation of energy. The moment breath ceases, the body is no longer alive, but the air we breathe does not belong to us. It belongs to the vast sky, the atmosphere shared by all beings. Each breath is borrowed. Each exhale is a silent act of letting go. When you see the body in this way, not as me or mine, but as a temporary gathering of elements, it changes everything. The fear of loss softens. The pride of ownership fades. And in its place comes humility, gratitude, and wisdom. Think of it like this. You are carrying a basket filled with gifts. Earth, water, fire, and wind were placed in it, not by you but by countless forces. Nature, parents, ancestors, karma. You carry this basket for a time, but eventually you must return it. No matter how tightly you cling, the gifts are not yours to keep. And yet, knowing this is not depressing. It is liberating. Because when you realize the body is only borrowed, you stop wasting energy trying to perfect it, control it, or cling to it. Instead, you begin to honor it. You treat it with care, not vanity. You use it to cultivate kindness, not arrogance. You live with it, but you do not live for it. The ancient monks practiced meditations on the elements for this very reason. Sitting quietly, they would reflect. This is not my body. This is earth, water, fire, and wind. With each reflection, attachment weakened and clarity grew. They saw themselves not as isolated beings, but as part of the great cycle of nature. Just as rivers flow, mountains rise, and winds shift, so too does this body come and go. Imagine, for a moment, a leaf falling from a tree. It lands on the ground, slowly decomposing, returning to soil, nourishing the earth for new life. That is the destiny of this body as well. Earth to earth, water to water, fire to fire, wind to wind. A cycle without beginning, without end. And if this is true, if the body is only a temporary weaving of the elements, then what does that say about the I who claims ownership of it? Who is this me that insists this is my body? Is it real, or just another illusion waiting to be seen through? As we turn this question over in our hearts, we begin to sense the deeper trap. The mistake of taking the body as our true identity. And it is here, in the shadow of that illusion, that our next journey unfolds. From the moment we are born, the world begins whispering a story into our ears. This is you. This body is who you are. Parents proudly point at our tiny hands and call them ours. As children, we discover our reflection in glass and cry or laugh because we believe it is truly me. We grow older and become more certain. My face, my hair, my skin, my beauty, my strength. Day after day, this illusion deepens. We come to believe that our entire identity is tied to this fragile shell. And so begins the trap. Society feeds it endlessly. Billboards flash images of flawless bodies. Magazines tell us what shape we should be. Social media filters out imperfection, selling us polished versions of humanity. Every corner of modern life whispers the same message. Your worth is your body. Your value is how you look. Your happiness depends on preserving this borrowed shell. But is that true? Consider this. When a flower blooms, its beauty is undeniable. But the flower itself does not cling to its petals. It does not resist the seasons. When the time comes, the petals fall. Only we humans stand trembling before impermanence, clutching desperately at what cannot be held. The Buddha pointed to this illusion with absolute clarity. There is no permanent self in this body. It changes from the moment of conception. Cells are born and die every second. The child's body becomes the teenagers, which becomes the adults, which becomes the elders. Which of these bodies was truly you? If the body you had at 5 years old is gone and the body you had at 15 is gone, then what exactly are you calling me today? And yet, we cling. We mistake the body for our identity, and in that mistake, we suffer. We fear aging as if it were a crime. We resist illness as if it were a personal insult. We dread death as if it were an erasure of self. This clinging makes us chase shadows, youth creams, fitness obsessions, surgeries, endless comparisons. But no matter how far we run, time runs faster. Think of the greatest kings and queens whose statues still stand in marble halls. Think of the celebrities whose faces once glowed across cinema screens. Where are they now? Their bodies have withered, their beauty faded, their strength gone. The world remembers their names, perhaps, but their bodies followed the same path as every farmer, every beggar, every monk. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And yet, knowing this, we still fall into the trap. We still wake up every morning and look into the mirror, judging ourselves harshly, fearing the signs of change. This is the power of illusion. It blinds us, even when we know the truth. But there is another way of seeing. The Buddha taught that the body is not the self. It is a vessel, a tool, a temporary vehicle. Like a traveler riding a horse across the desert, you are not the horse. You guide it, you use it, you depend on it. But when the journey ends, you dismount. You never mistake the horse for who you truly are. So why do we mistake the body for the self? Because the illusion is strong and the attachment is deep. But the moment we begin to see through it, freedom appears. When you no longer cling to the body as identity, aging loses its sting. Illness loses its terror. Even death begins to look less like an ending and more like a natural transition. This does not mean we neglect the body. Just as a traveler takes care of his horse, we too care for this vessel. We feed it, clean it, rest it. But we do not confuse it with who we are. We use it wisely, knowing it is borrowed, knowing it will one day be returned. And if we are not the body, then who or what are we? If the body is only a vehicle, then what is the passenger it carries? To answer this, we must look not at the strength of muscles or the smoothness of skin, but at something more subtle, the mind, the awareness, the consciousness that looks out through these borrowed eyes. And as we turn our attention inward, a new truth begins to take shape. Time is a quiet artist. It paints with invisible strokes, working slowly, patiently, until one day we wake up and realize the masterpiece it has left upon our skin. At first, the changes are subtle. A strand of gray hair, a wrinkle at the corner of the eyes, a little stiffness in the knees when rising in the morning. We notice, we sigh, we laugh it off. But little by little, the signs gather like clouds before a storm. And though we may resist, though we may cover it with creams, dyes, and surgeries, time whispers softly, this body is not yours to keep. In youth, the body feels limitless. We run, we climb, we dance without effort. The mirror reflects vitality, and we believe it will always be this way. But aging is patient, it waits. And when it arrives, it teaches us one of the most profound truths of existence. Impermanence is not theory. It is reality, etched into our very bones. Think of the strongest warrior you can imagine, the kind who once lifted heavy swords and struck fear into enemies. With time, even he leans on a cane. Think of the most beautiful queen, adored by thousands, her face immortalized in portraits. With time, her features fade, her beauty withers. Think of the athletes, the singers, the models of today. Where will they be in 50 years? Their voices weaker, their steps slower, their bodies humbled by age. This is not cruelty. This is nature. Aging is not a punishment, but a reminder. A reminder that we are living on borrowed time within a borrowed body. And yet, most of us spend our lives fearing this reminder. We dread birthdays as if numbers could curse us. We hide gray hair, cover wrinkles, pretend that aging happens only to others. But every moment of resistance steals away the chance to live fully in the present. The Buddha encouraged reflection on aging not to frighten us, but to free us. He taught his monks to meditate on this truth. I am of the nature to grow old. I have not gone beyond aging. Such reflection does not breed despair. It breeds wisdom. It softens arrogance. It opens the heart. Because when we accept aging, we begin to see the gift it offers, perspective. Youth often believes life will last forever, wasting time on trivial pursuits, endless desires, shallow competitions. Age strips away these illusions. What once seemed urgent, possessions, status, appearances, slowly loses its shine. What remains is what truly matters: kindness, wisdom, compassion, love. Look into the eyes of an elder who has lived fully, and you will see a different kind of beauty. Not the fleeting beauty of youth, but the radiance of understanding, the glow of acceptance. Wrinkles become lines of poetry, each one a verse of experience. Gray hair becomes a crown of wisdom. The body may weaken, but the spirit deepens. In this way, aging is not an enemy, but a teacher. A slow, patient guide that leads us toward humility, toward clarity, toward liberation. It reminds us that the body is only borrowed and that clinging to it brings suffering. But if we let go, if we embrace impermanence, then every day becomes precious. Every moment becomes sacred. Imagine waking up tomorrow and truly knowing that this body will not stay young, not stay strong, not stay forever. How would you live differently? Would you still waste hours scrolling, comparing, envying? Or would you cherish the laughter of a friend, the warmth of the sun, the breath that rises and falls? Aging is the gentle hand on our shoulder, reminding us to wake up, to stop living as though tomorrow is guaranteed, to recognize that time is moving with or without our permission. And if we listen carefully, we will hear its message: do not fear me. I am here to teach you what is real. I am here to guide you home. And yet, aging is only one of the body's reminders. There is another, more sudden, more striking, that comes not with patience but with force. The reminder of illness. There are moments when life stops us in our tracks. One day we feel strong, unstoppable, moving through the world with confidence. And then suddenly, a fever, a pain, a diagnosis. The body, which once felt reliable, reveals its fragility. Illness is the great reminder we try to avoid. We prefer to believe that sickness happens to others, not to us. Yet no one escapes it. Even the healthiest, the most disciplined, the most careful will one day find themselves in bed, humbled by the body's limits. Think of a candle flame. It glows steadily, giving warmth and light. But even the smallest draft can make it flicker. The human body is the same. A virus unseen by the naked eye can bring down the strongest person. A single malfunctioning cell can change a life forever. We call this body mind, but in truth, we cannot even guarantee its next heartbeat. The Buddha taught that illness is not a punishment nor a curse. It is simply part of the body's nature. To be born is to be subject to sickness, just as surely as we are subject to aging and death. Ignoring this truth does not protect us. It only makes the shock greater when illness comes. But what if we could meet sickness not with fear but with wisdom? There are stories of monks who, when struck with illness, did not despair. Instead, they used their sickness as a teacher. Lying in pain, they asked, "Who is suffering? Is it the body, or is it the mind clinging to the body?" Again and again they saw, The pain belonged to the flesh, but suffering arose when the mind claimed, "This is me. This is mine." One monk, weakened by years of sickness, was asked if he ever felt anger at his body's decline. He smiled and said, "Would you be angry at a leaf for falling in autumn? The body follows its season. It is not betraying me, it is teaching me." What a profound way to see illness, not as an enemy, but as a mirror reflecting impermanence. When the body falls sick, it strips away illusions. It shows us directly what books and sermons can only hint at, that the body is not under our control. It is a borrowed vessel, subject to forces beyond us. And strangely, illness can awaken compassion. When we are healthy, we take life for granted. We rush, we compete, we compare. But when we are ill, suddenly we understand the suffering of others. The cough of a stranger, the frailty of an elder, the struggle of someone in pain, they are no longer distant. We see ourselves in them. Illness humbles us, softens us, connects us. Of course, this does not mean sickness is easy. Pain hurts. Fatigue drains. Fear creeps in. But when we see illness through the lens of Dharma, we can hold it differently. We can meet it with patience, with presence, with the quiet courage of knowing this too is part of the path. Imagine lying in a hospital bed. Machines beep softly. The body feels heavy, weak. In that moment, you realize that all the titles, possessions, and ambitions mean little. What matters is not how powerful or beautiful you once were, but whether your heart is at peace. Illness has a way of cutting through the noise, leaving only what is real. And in that silence, a question arises. If the body is so fragile, so easily broken, why do we cling to it as if it were eternal? The truth is, illness is not here to rob us. It is here to remind us. Remind us to care for this borrowed body while we have it, but not to mistake it for who we are. Remind us to use our time wisely because tomorrow's health is never promised. Remind us to live with compassion because suffering is universal. Yes, illness humbles us, but in humility, wisdom grows. And just as sickness teaches us of fragility, there comes a moment when the lesson deepens, when the body's final truth can no longer be postponed. That moment is death, the ultimate return of what was never ours. There is a silence that falls over every life. A silence no one can escape, no matter how powerful, how wealthy, how beautiful, or how strong. That silence is death, the final reminder that the body was never ours to begin with. We live as though death is far away, as though it belongs to someone else. We attend funerals, we see obituaries, but deep down we whisper, "Not me. Not yet." And yet every day death walks beside us, closer than our own shadow. With each breath we borrow, there is no guarantee that the next one will come. The Buddha taught that of all reflections, the contemplation of death is the most urgent, not to fill us with fear, but to wake us from sleep. Because once we see death clearly, life takes on a different meaning. Think of a borrowed house. You may live in it for years, but one day the owner comes to take it back. You cannot bargain, you cannot plead. You leave behind the furniture, the decorations, even the walls that sheltered you. In the same way, when death arrives, the body returns to the elements, earth to earth, water to water, fire to fire, wind to wind. What we called me dissolves back into the vastness of nature. Stand at the edge of a graveyard and look around. Every stone tells the same truth. Kings, beggars, mothers, children, all return their borrowed bodies. The earth makes no exceptions. In ancient Buddhist practice, monks would meditate among charnel grounds. They would sit quietly beside bodies in different stages of decay, watching as skin darkened, as flesh gave way to bone, as bone turned to dust. This was not morbid curiosity, it was liberation. To see death so directly is to shatter illusion. It is to understand this body is not mine. It is only a guest, and it will leave without asking my permission. But here lies the paradox. Though death is certain, we live as if we will not die. We chase possession, status, fleeting pleasures as though we had infinite tomorrows. And in that chasing, we forget to live today. What if instead we carry death in our awareness, not as a weight, but as a guide? Imagine waking each morning with the quiet knowledge, I too am of the nature to die. I do not know when, I do not know how, but I know it will come. How differently would you treat the people you love? How carefully would you choose your words? How much more deeply would you live each moment? Death, when seen clearly, is not the enemy. It is the great equalizer, the great awakener. It strips away illusion, reminding us that we own nothing, not this body, not our wealth, not even our breath. And yet in that stripping away, a freedom appears. Because if nothing can truly be held, then there is nothing to fear in letting go. The Buddha once said, "Of all footprints, the elephant's is the greatest. Of all contemplations, the contemplation of death is the greatest." Why? Because remembering death cuts through delusion. It shows us what matters and what does not. It urges us to live wisely, compassionately, meaningfully before the borrowed time runs out. When you sit with the truth of death, something shifts. Petty arguments lose their power. Greed loosens its grip. Hatred begins to crumble. What rises in their place is love, patience, gratitude. Suddenly, the smile of a child, the kindness of a friend, the beauty of a sunset all become miracles because you know they will not last, and that is what makes them precious. Yes, death is certain, but that certainty is not a curse. It is a gift. A gift that calls us to awaken now, to stop postponing life, to stop clinging to what must be returned. Because when the body is finally laid down, when breath no longer rises and the elements return to their source, what remains is not what we own, but how we lived. The echo of our choices, the imprint of our compassion, the seeds of our actions, these outlive the fragile shell of flesh and bone. And so, the question lingers. If the body is borrowed and will be returned, what is it that continues on? What carries the fragrance of our deeds beyond the grave? To find that answer, we must look beyond the body into the mind, into the stream of consciousness that flows even when the vessel is gone. When the body is laid down, when breath dissolves into silence, we might wonder, is this the end, or is it only a doorway? The Buddha taught that what we call self is not a solid entity but a flowing stream. The body is one part of that stream but not the whole. When the body ceases, the stream continues. Consciousness does not vanish into nothingness. It carries forward, shaped by the seeds of our actions, our intentions, our choices. Think of a flame passing from one candle to another. The first candle may burn out, but its light continues. Or think of a river. It never holds the same water twice, yet it flows on uninterrupted. Our mind is like this, ever-changing, yet continuous, moving beyond the limits of flesh. For centuries, people have feared death because they believed it was a wall, but the Buddha revealed it to be a threshold. The body returns to dust, but the currents of mind, our habits, our karma, our tendencies move onward. What you nurture in this life is what sails with you beyond the grave. This is why practice matters. Every act of kindness, every moment of mindfulness, every seed of compassion you plant in your heart becomes part of the stream. They do not vanish. They are carried forward. Just as anger, greed, and ignorance, if left unchecked, shape the direction of the current. A king may lose his crown, a warrior his strength, a beauty her face, but the quality of the mind, that is what endures. It is the true legacy, the invisible thread that binds one life to the next. There is a story of a dying monk. As he lay on his bed, disciples gathered, asking if he feared the end. He smiled gently and said, "Why fear the end of something that was never mine? The body falls away, but the mind, purified by practice, flows on like a clear stream." Such clarity is not only for monks, it is for all of us. We do not need to wait for death to recognize the continuity of mind. We can see it every day. The anger we feel today, if not understood, becomes tomorrow's bitterness. The compassion we show today becomes tomorrow's peace. The mind is not confined to a moment. It is a chain of causes and effects, weaving our reality. This is why mindfulness is so powerful. To watch the mind is to watch the very stream that will shape not only this life, but what comes after. If we neglect it, the stream may run wild, carrying us into suffering. But if we tend it with wisdom, it becomes a river of peace, guiding us beyond fear. And here lies the great paradox. Though the body is fragile and temporary, the mind, when cultivated, can touch something timeless. In the stillness of meditation, many practitioners have glimpsed a state beyond birth and death, beyond the restless current. They speak of it not as a theory but as a direct experience, a vast awareness untouched by decay, an openness that is neither born nor destroyed. So perhaps the real question is not, what happens when I die? But rather, what am I nurturing now? What seeds am I planting in the garden of my mind? Because whatever we sow, the continuity of mind will carry forward. Death is not the end. It is a chapter in a much longer story, a story written by the mind itself. And if we learn to guide that mind with wisdom and compassion, then even beyond the breaking of the body, the journey continues in light. And yet, if the mind flows beyond the body, does that mean it is truly me? Or is even consciousness itself another illusion we cling to? To answer this, we must look deeper into the nature of identity, the subtle trap that keeps us bound to suffering. For all the reflections on impermanence, aging, sickness, and death, wisdom alone is not enough. Understanding must be lived, embodied, practiced. And perhaps the most direct way to begin is through mindfulness of the body. The Buddha often taught, in this very body with its perception and thought lies the path to liberation. It may surprise us. How could the body, this fragile, borrowed vessel, point to freedom? Yet it is precisely because the body is impermanent that it becomes such a powerful teacher. When you sit quietly and bring your awareness inward, the body reveals truths no book can fully explain. Start with the breath. Simple, unnoticed, yet constant. Feel the rise and fall of your chest, the subtle rhythm that has been carrying you since the moment you were born. You do not command the breath, it moves on its own, a reminder that even this most intimate function is not truly under your control. With each inhalation, life enters. With each exhalation, life is released. Every breath is a letting go. Then notice the body itself. Scan it slowly as if you were meeting an old friend. The tension in the shoulders, the heaviness in the legs, the quiet beating of the heart. Each sensation arises, changes, and fades. The body is never still. Even in stillness, it shifts and flows. This practice is not about judgment. It is not about clinging to pleasure or pushing away pain. It is about seeing clearly. A pleasant sensation comes, notice it. An ache arises, notice it. Neither lasts, both are teachers. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha gave practical ways to reflect on the body. He encouraged contemplation of its parts, hair, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, blood, bone, not to create disgust but to pierce through illusion. We so often worship the body, chase after its beauty and cling to its strength. But when seen in its reality, the body is a collection of elements, not a self. There is another practice, contemplating the body as subject to decay. In ancient times, monks would sit in charnel ground, watching corpses return to dust. Today, we can reflect in gentler ways, by remembering those we have loved and lost, by recognizing that our own body is walking the same path. This is not meant to sadden us, but to awaken gratitude. How precious this moment is, how fleeting this breath, how rare this opportunity to practice. But mindfulness of the body is not confined to meditation cushions or monasteries. It can be lived in daily life. When you walk, notice the touch of your feet against the earth. When you eat, taste each bite fully, aware of the gift it represents. When you wash your hands, feel the water, cool and cleansing. Every action, when met with awareness, becomes sacred. Why does this matter? Because the body is the doorway to the present. The mind can wander endlessly into the past, into the future, into fantasies and fears. But the body is always here. To return to the body is to return to now. And the now is the only place where freedom can be found. There is a story of a woman grieving the loss of her child. In her sorrow, she sought the Buddha's help. He gave her a simple instruction to sit quietly, breathe, and feel her body. At first, she resisted. How could this ease her grief? But as she practiced, she began to notice that even the sharpest pain shifted with the breath. Nothing, not even sorrow, remained unchanged. Slowly, gently, her heart began to heal. This is the gift of mindfulness of the body. It grounds us when the mind is restless. It steadies us when emotions surge. It teaches us that nothing, not even suffering, is permanent. And in that realization, a quiet freedom arises. So when you next feel overwhelmed, return to the body. Breathe, notice, rest in awareness. The body may not be yours to keep, but it can be your teacher if you listen. And as the body teaches us presence, mindfulness begins to reach deeper, revealing that what we call self is not as solid as we once believed. If the body is impermanent, if sensations rise and fall, what then is this I we cling to so tightly? We have followed the body through its illusions, its fragility, its inevitable return to the elements. And now a question arises. If this body is borrowed, how should we live while it is still in our care? The truth is, a borrowed body is not a curse. It is a gift, a fleeting, fragile opportunity to walk the path, to learn, to love, to awaken. But to live wisely in this body requires remembering what it truly is, temporary, dependent, and not ours to keep. Think of being handed a precious vase. You know it must be returned. Would you toss it carelessly in a corner? Would you obsessively polish it, terrified of every scratch? Neither extreme makes sense. Instead, you would hold it with care, use it with respect, and when the time came, return it without regret. The body is no different. Living wisely means balance. It means caring for the body, feeding it, resting it, moving it, not out of vanity, but out of gratitude. It means protecting its health, not to defy death, but to honor the life it makes possible. And it also means not becoming enslaved to it, not chasing beauty endlessly, not fearing wrinkles, not clinging to what must fade. The Buddha himself cared for his body, washing it, resting it, nourishing it. But he also sat beneath the Bodhi tree without fear, ready to let that body go if awakening demanded it. He taught us by example. Care for the body, but do not mistake it for the self. To live wisely in a borrowed body also means using it in service of something greater than desire. Hands can grasp or they can give. A voice can wound or it can heal. Feet can wander aimlessly or they can walk the path of compassion. What we do with this body is what defines the quality of our life, not how it looks, not how long it lasts, but how it is used. Consider this. When the body is gone, no one will remember the shape of your muscles, the smoothness of your skin, or the number of years you lived. What will remain are the imprints of your actions, the kindness you offered, the wisdom you shared, the compassion you cultivated. These are the true legacies of a borrowed body. And wisdom also means presence. Too often, we live as though life were a rehearsal, postponing joy, postponing practice, waiting for some perfect moment that never comes. But the body reminds us daily, time is limited. Breath is uncertain. Tomorrow is not promised. To live wisely is to live now. To truly taste your food, to truly listen when someone speaks, to truly feel the sun on your skin. Because every moment in this body is borrowed, every moment is precious. There is a story told of a master who was asked, "What is the most important practice?" He replied, "To be aware that death can come at any time. Then every action becomes meaningful, every word becomes kind." This awareness does not make life heavy, it makes it luminous. It frees us from wasting time on trivialities. It teaches us to forgive quickly, to love deeply, to let go of what does not matter. So, living wisely in a borrowed body means walking the middle path, caring but not clinging, enjoying but not grasping, acting but with awareness. Every breath is both a gift and a reminder. You are alive now, but this too shall pass. And when we live with such wisdom, something extraordinary happens. The fear of losing the body softens because we have used it well. The regret of impermanence fades because we have lived fully. Death, when it comes, is not a thief but a natural return. And perhaps that is the greatest wisdom of all. To live in such a way that when the body is finally returned, we can let it go with gratitude, with peace, with no clinging left. Because the body was borrowed, but how we used it, that was always in our hands. And so, as we prepare to close this journey, one final reflection remains. What does it truly mean to release the illusion of ownership and rest in freedom? We began with an illusion that this body is ours, that we own it, that it will last. And together we have walked through its truths, its elements, its aging, its sickness, its death, the continuity of mind and the power of awareness. Now we arrive at the heart of the journey, letting go. Letting go does not mean neglect. It does not mean denial. It means seeing clearly. The body is borrowed. It was never ours to keep. To cling to it is to suffer. To understand its nature is to be free. When we let go, the body can be what it is: a temporary home, a teacher, a vessel for practice. We no longer demand that it defy time or bend to our desires. We honor it, but we do not chain ourselves to it. And in that freedom, the heart begins to breathe. Letting go also means loosening the grip on identity. We are not this skin, not these bones, not even the thoughts that rise and fall like waves. What we truly are is deeper, a vast awareness that cannot be owned, cannot be broken, cannot be taken away. Imagine carrying a heavy pack up a mountain. Every step is a struggle. Then at last you set it down. The air feels lighter, your body freer, your spirit open. This is the taste of letting go. The burdens were never who you were. They were only what you carried. So too with this body, with its cravings, its fears, its endless demands. When you release the illusion of ownership, you discover the quiet joy of simply being. Life becomes less about holding on and more about flowing with what is. And in this flowing, something beautiful awakens: gratitude. Gratitude for the breath, fleeting though it is. Gratitude for the people who walk beside us, fragile and temporary just like us. Gratitude for the chance to practice, to love, to awaken, even if only for a little while in this borrowed form, because the miracle was never in keeping the body. The miracle was in using it wisely, in seeing through it, in touching the timeless within the temporary. This is the freedom the Buddha pointed to. Not freedom from the body nor from the world, but freedom within them. A freedom born of understanding, a freedom born of letting go. And so, as we close this journey, carry with you this truth. Your body is borrowed, your time is fleeting, but your heart can be vast. Your wisdom boundless, your compassion without end. When the body is returned, you will not lose who you truly are. You will only shed what was never yours. And in that letting go, there is no loss at all, only freedom. If these reflections touch something within you, if they stirred a quiet reminder of what is fleeting and what is timeless, then perhaps this is the path you were meant to walk. Here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we share these teachings not as doctrines to believe, but as lanterns to light the way. If this resonated with you, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe and let this space be a gentle reminder in your daily life. May every video you find here serve as a pause, a breath, a step closer to freedom. May it help you live more mindfully, love more deeply, and let go more gracefully. This body is borrowed, but wisdom, compassion, and peace, they can endure. So walk with us. The journey is lighter when traveled together.